We're going to continue with our introduction and overview of collaborative dialogic practices. We're going to shift from Shishiwan doing sequential translation to using subtitles. This will give Shishiwan and me an opportunity to talk with each other and for me to hear some of the things that she's been thinking and might like to add in as I've been talking.
我跟哈令老师在这个部分的对话跟前面会不一样啊。我们前面呢，我就是做翻译啊。那在这个部分呢，我会跟哈令老师对话啊，然后大家会在那个荧幕上下头看到翻译的字幕。为什么要这么做呢？因为我们这样子的话，就是我可以有机会跟哈令老师对话啊，然后有时候我可能也会用中文跟大家谈一谈我对于哈令老师说的东西，我的想法是什么。
Okay, so as I mentioned in an earlier segment, that these assumptions that we were drawn to began to give us a new language, new words, new vocabulary, a new way of understanding our experiences and the experiences of our clients. And then we began to think, okay, so if this is a new understanding, what are we understanding? How are we thinking differently about our experiences in therapy, what we're doing and what we're trying to do in the way that we think about our clients? So I began to think of two things. I began to think of collaborative relationships and dialogical conversations. And chose the word collaborative because these ideas began developing in a medical center. And for those of you who've worked in medical context or might be working in medical context now, or at least certainly in the States, there is a phrase that's often used, and it's called compliant patient. Compliant patient, meaning the patient does what the doctor or nurse wants them to do. So it means complying with. And we didn't want our colleagues and the people that we were doing workshops with to think that we were talking about cooperative in that sense. So we decided to choose the word collaborative. However, if you look in an English dictionary, collaborative and cooperative have almost the exact same definition. But what we wanted to emphasize is this notion of with, doing with, being with, thinking with, talking with, acting with another person. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. And then we also began to think in terms of dialogue and conversations, and a particular kind of conversation that we began to call a dialogic or dialogical conversation. So we begin to think of therapy as that. Therapy involves collaborative relationships and dialogic conversations. And then people would say, but how do we do that? What do I do? Tell me, what are the techniques? And we began to be very provocative, or at least I did, and say that I don't think in terms of techniques or skills.
Yeah, I mean that as I listen to you, I recognize that things that you talk about has sort of historical context. I mean, and also has its own evolution.
Right, and that as we were saying yesterday, the ideas have evolved over decades now.
Yes.
And are still evolving.
Yes.
So let me talk a little bit more about collaborative relationships and dialogic conversations, and then we'll shift into how do we do this? How do we put this into action? How do we perform it? But first, I want to show you a photograph that I took in Havana, Cuba, in one of their main squares. And this is a bronze sculpture that was done by the French artist Etienne. And the title of the sculpture is called Conversation. And it just really struck me in terms of two people posed or poised. They're very engaged with each other intensively. And then secondly, what struck me were the blank spaces that you can see through. And I began to think in terms of, this is a beautiful example of how when you talk with someone, you're always in the process of trying to understand them, but you can really never know anything about them except what they show you or what they tell you. And in that sense, you're always interpreting what you think you're seeing and what you think you're hearing. So I really loved the blank spaces, which you might think of as the unsaid. There are things that might be there that haven't been said, and there are things that might not be said because they haven't been created yet. Okay, so again, I just thought this was a wonderful sculpture, and maybe we can go to the next PPT and talk a little bit about collaboration, because I see them in collaborative dialogue. They're very, very engaged with each other, like you and me, the one's talking with his or her hand.
Yes, a very unusual sculpture. Okay.
Okay, so what began to happen is that we begin to think in terms of the therapist as being decentralized. The therapist wasn't the center of therapy. The therapist wasn't the director of therapy. So we began to think in terms of collaborative relationships as a way in which we orient ourselves to be in relationship with the other person, to respond to them, to talk with them, to gesture with them, so that we begin to be involved in something that's more what could be called a shared engagement or joint action. In other words, doing something together. And then I began to think in terms of the 3 C's, a relationship in which people connect, collaborate, and create with each other. And began to think in terms of a collaborative relationship as just simply one kind of social activity, one way in which people engage and join with each other and begin to form a community. So, for example, a community can be 2 people, like the 2 people in the sculpture. It can be the 2 of us here, we're the community conducting this, or it can be a community in a larger sense in terms of a classroom as a community, a organization as a community, a geographical space, or a group of people located geographically. But what's important in any kind of community, this kind of social activity, is that people have a sense that they are participating, which I think invites a sense of belonging. I think a sense of belonging invites a sense of joining in the creation of what you are producing. And if you want to call it the solution or the outcome or the resolution that one is striving for in therapy or in counseling. And that I think because people participate, have a sense of belonging, and are contributing, that they have more of a sense of a shared accountability, a shared responsibility. That it's not that the therapist is responsible for the therapy, nor is the client responsible for the therapy, but they share in the responsibility for what's being created, and as the therapy moves along. I think also that this combines and leads to what I called dynamic sustainability. That the process that's generated, that's beginning to be created, begins to have some life outside of the therapy room, that it's not contained in the therapy room. And I think often the most important things and the most useful things in therapy don't necessarily have to happen in the therapy room, but can you create something that has some kind of life or sustainability, generative sustainability, not sustainability in the sense of staying fixed, but a generative sustainability as people move on outside the therapy room, not only the clients, but for the therapist, him or herself.
Wow.
So something you might want to add at this moment?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that, how to invite people for engaging, to participate. That is not something that usually people might be thinking about. Can you say more about the significance of invitation?
If you don't mind, I will talk about that, but in just a few minutes.
Okay.
When I talk about the philosophical stance and what I call action guiding
Yes,
sensitivities.
yes.
In other words, when I
Yes.
move into putting these into action, if you don't mind.
Now, of course. So
okay.
maybe I speak a little bit in Chinese.
Okay.
Yes. 我想说的是，合作这种思维听起来好像是很简单的话，但是要怎么去思考什么叫合作，怎么样子去邀请人们去参与在关系里，让大家可以不断的觉得是有归属感的。我觉得这些思维特别的深刻。比如说，我们怎么样子在工作里能够让团队觉得大家都可以邀请进来，共同去参与。然后我们如何在家庭里可以有这种参与感？怎么样去邀请？我们怎么在咨询里去邀请、去参与？那哈令老师待会会再多说一点啊。
Okay, and so maybe we'll go to the next PPT,
Okay.
if you don't mind. Continuing on collaborative.
Uh-huh.
And this is what I was just talking about, but I wanted to show you up on the screen, that we become conversational partners in conversation, partners in dialogue, who work and create and learn together, depending on the context, whether it's the therapy or the counseling room, the educational room, living life on an everyday basis with other people, because we don't do that in isolation. And I think also to be collaborative, it's very important to appreciate and value the expertise, the truths and knowledge that each person brings to the encounter, and particularly their experiences and their descriptions and their understanding of their experiences. So then if we move on to talking about dialogue, we're talking about dialogic conversations, a particular kind of conversation, a particular way of talking and responding with each other. So maybe we could go to that slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so dialogical conversation. We have three things here. Again, we're talking about a particular kind of conversation in which people are interacting with each other and with themselves, I think, out loud as well as silently. So dialogue, this is really important, I think. Dialogue does not necessarily have to be the spoken words. And the dialogue is more than words, whether they're spoken or silent. It's any of the manners or the gestures that we use to communicate, to express ourselves, or to articulate for ourselves as well as for another person. So I also then say, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, that they engage in a mutual or shared inquiry about the issues at hand, in which they're jointly looking into, jointly reflecting on, jointly questioning, taking a critical look at something together. And that I think that dialogue is a natural, spontaneous activity that occurs moment to moment. Now, this doesn't mean that dialogue is necessarily something that is always smooth or harmonious. And because dialogue isn't. When we talk with people and we're exploring together, we're taking different paths, we're meandering, we're wandering around, we're stopping here for a while, we decide to turn and go over here for a while, we may speed up, we may slow down, there may be tensions. So dialogue is not necessarily smooth, and I certainly do not want to give that impression.
Can you say a little bit more about, like, when people are in conflict, what might be the dialogical conversation in conflict?
Well, it's okay to disagree, and it's okay to, if you want to call it, argue. But can you also then be able to maintain a curiosity about the other person's perspective? One of the things that gets us into trouble is that we're always interpreting another person's, or not, I shouldn't say always, but often we interpret another person's actions or words from our own maps, our own meaning maps, our own understanding maps, rather than trying to understand them from their perspective. And I find that when you try to learn about another person from their perspective, you try to understand that more, that somehow that allows one to relax. You don't have to give up your opinion or your idea about them, but it is no longer holds this sort of controversial emotional aspect to it.
Wow, wow. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay, so a few more things about dialogue. Now, I say that dialogue requires pausing, reflecting, carefulness, and preparing. And I got this idea that one time, and the only time that I was ever able to see Gregory Bateson live, he said something that just stuck with me. And he said, I always need about 7 seconds to think about what I've just heard and to prepare my response. So he's talking about thoughtfulness. He's talking about pausing, giving ourselves time to really listen, to think about what we think we've heard the other person say, and to prepare our response to that person. And again, I say dialogue requires being spontaneous and flexible. So for me, dialogue, again, is something that's more natural. It's not something that you follow a recipe or a particular structure. It's not something that has steps. It's not something that you plan ahead of time, but you must be prepared for dialogue with the other person by the attitude that you bring and the values that you bring regarding yourself, the other person, and what you hope to accomplish together. And I say dialogue requires becoming human, and I usually talk about that in many, many different ways, and particularly in terms of thinking about not performing a role as a therapist, but that you are simply a human being or another human being in a room with another human being or multiple other human beings. That we can get trapped into performing a role and trying to do what we think we should be doing in that role. And therefore we really can't be present with the other person, and we cannot engage with them in a more natural and spontaneous way. And I say transformation is inevitable in dialogue, and it's not only inevitable, but it's unpredictable. Because when you begin talking about something, you begin working with someone on a project in a more collaborative, dialogic fashion, you can't predict where you're going to end up or how you're going to get there. It's important to have an idea about where you want to end up and where you want to go, but you don't want to be married to that. You want to be flexible, to be able to change the course and the destination as you go along together. So I think I'll pause there, see if you have something to say, and then...
I think that I probably could talk in Chinese.
Okay, why don't you talk in Chinese a little bit?
Yeah. 我刚刚在听哈令老师在讲对话的时候，就让我想到说，对话还真的不是那么简单啊，它还真的背后有一些理念啊。刚刚我在问哈令老师说，如果人们在冲突里面，那要怎么对话？那他的回应说，在冲突里不要带着原来的想法去跟对方在一起，然后在冲突里仍然需要好奇。那我就在想说，冲突中的好奇是一件很不简单的事情，因为冲突会有情绪啊，冲突会有不舒服，那如何在冲突里好奇？所以这里面有很多的细节，可以去摸索，可以去思考啊。然后我觉得他在说，就是它是一种自然的方式，让我想到他常常提到，就是一种 a way of being， 一种存在的方式。啊，那我就在想说，大家如果刚开始在学合作，可能会觉得有些理念 可能还要一点时间琢磨，但是你们就细细的去体会他说的东西是什么，然后他可能需要一些时间啊，然后慢慢的累积，那么可能就大家会看到他到底是怎么回事。那我想说的是，他其实在邀请大家去思考我们到底是怎么跟人们对话，然后我们可以如何跟人们对话，这样子。Okay.
So then I began to think, okay, so how do I think about collaborative relationships and dialogical conversations? I don't necessarily think of them as techniques that you put into action that are informed by a theory.
Okay.
Okay. So let me just introduce this notion of philosophical stance, because I begin to think, okay, the ideas, the assumptions that I'm drawing from that I found valuable and important for me in the way that I think about and practice my work is that it's a philosophy of life. It's a philosophical position that one takes. And it's a philosophical position that one takes as a professional and in one's everyday ordinary life. That I begin to think that it's important to have some congruence and some coherence in terms of what we do, how we are in the world, how we interact, how we engage with others in both our professional and our personal lives. In other words, we shouldn't be one way in our everyday life and then put on a uniform or think we're going to perform a role as we enter the counseling or therapy room or the coaching or the consulting room. So again, I began to call it a philosophical stance. And as you said, ways of being, and what I've shifted this to is not only ways of being, but ways of being and becoming with another person.
Yes.
Because it's multiple ways of being, because whomever we're interacting with, what the occasion is, the context is, and all of those other factors influence what I think of as what's called forth from me, the particular way I will be with that person. And I added becoming because we are becoming together, each something different than we were when we walked into the relationship with each other.
Yes, yes.
So perhaps we can pause here.
Yes, yes.
And come back to this and then go into the features of the philosophical stance, which then begins to answer those important questions. But how do I do this? What do I do? What are the skills? What are the techniques? What's the method?
I like to say a little bit more about ways of being with, and also
please.
multiple ways of being, because what you talk about, that is so rich itself. So I will talk a little bit more in Chinese. Yeah. 我非常喜欢刚刚哈令说的，就是我们每个人存在的方式不是只有一种啊，我们每个人都有多元的存在方式。我们可能在不同的情境，或是在跟不同的人，都会邀请不同的我们出来，所以不要去想说我们只有一种存在的方式。而且老师刚刚提到那个 with， 就是这种存在的方式是如何在关系里跟人们在一起。我觉得这种多元的视野，去看到说我们每个人都有很多不同的可能性，跟不同的人在一起，那我们可以如何去建构，如何去创造这个东西，特别的好玩，特别的有创造力，不会把人放在一个框框里，说我只能用这个模样去呈现。然后可能有时候人们在跟这个情境的时候是一个样子，在另外一个情境的时候也许是另外一个样子跟人们在一起，所以我觉得这种自我的突破、自我的成长是非常丰富的。然后前面他提到说那个理论跟实践是一致的，不是说我们讲了这个，然后我们做的东西是分开的，这种一致性我觉得也是很可以去思索的因为我们生活里面要去看看如何实践，然后我们要怎么样子让这个理论跟我们这个人是可以整合。我有一些学员会跟我说，他们很喜欢去找一些 老师或是长者，他们那个人说的话跟他们表达出来的东西是一致的啊，所以我想那个一致对很多人都很重要。Talk about consistency.
Consistency in our lives and in our ways of being. That's very important.
Yes,
I appreciate your emphasizing that.
Yes, say something more. Okay.
So I think if we pause and we invite our viewers to do what we've been saying that postmodernism invites, and that is to step back and reflect on what you've been hearing and looking at as you've been viewing this video, and to think in terms of the conversation you've been having with yourself if you've been watching it, continuing to have a conversation with yourself if you're alone or if you're with others, to pause and join with each other in a conversation. See what appeals to you, what catches your attention, what makes you go, ouch, and what questions are emerging for you at this time.
Yes, that's a great idea. That's a great idea.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.